Chapter 1. A Fateful Journey. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the village of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple prepared for her journey. Her quaint cottage, adorned with blooming roses and ivy, was a picture of serene domesticity. Today, however, Miss Marple felt a flutter of excitement, a rarity in her otherwise tranquil life. She was to visit an old acquaintance, Lady Eleanor Whittaker, at the newly inherited Whispering Manor. Such invitations were not common, and Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. Dressed in her favourite navy blue coat, Miss Marple packed her essentials with methodical precision, a well-worn copy of a detective novel, knitting needles, and a small notebook for her observations. With a gentle pat on the head, she bid farewell to Button, her plump tabby cat, who seemed unperturbed by her departure. At St. Mary Mead Station, the hustle and bustle of morning commuters filled the air with a symphony of sounds. Miss Marple navigated the crowd with characteristic grace, finding her way to the Silver Line Express, a sleek train renowned for its comfort and punctuality. Settling into her first-class compartment by the window, she admired the polished wood panels and plush seating. The compartment was shared with a small group of passengers, each seemingly absorbed in their own worlds. Across the aisle sat Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, a lady of impeccable taste. Her makeup was flawlessly applied, enhancing her striking features, and her emerald gown spoke of understated elegance. Beside her, two children, Edward and Clara, chattered softly, their laughter adding a touch of warmth to the carriage. At the far end, a stern-looking man with a newspaper clutched tightly in his hands occupied the adjacent seat. Miss Marple noted his tense posture, sensing a story behind his rigid facade. As the train began to chug forward, Miss Marple gazed out the window at the rolling countryside, her mind already weaving through the possibilities of the weekend ahead. Her sharp eyes took in the vibrant red scarf of a lady seated nearby, the meticulous way the porter adjusted his cap, and the quiet intensity of the man engrossed in his newspaper. Each detail was a thread in the intricate tapestry of human behavior she so loved to observe. Midway through the journey, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks was interrupted by a sudden commotion in the corridor. Passengers murmured in confusion, casting nervous glances toward the source of the disturbance. Miss Marple, ever observant, rose gracefully to investigate, her curiosity as keen as ever. Approaching the crowded area, she found herself face to face with the conductor, a stout man with a ruddy complexion and a furrowed brow. "Something's terribly wrong, Miss Marple," he whispered urgently. "There's been an accident." Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the familiar thrill of a mystery unfolding. "An accident, you say? May I be of assistance?" The conductor hesitated before nodding. "I believe it's best if you speak to Dr. Henry Lawson. He's with us on this journey." With a polite nod, Miss Marple made her way through the uneasy crowd to find Dr. Lawson, a local historian she had met briefly at the village fete last summer. Dr. Lawson, a distinguished gentleman with spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, was speaking in hushed tones with a young woman dressed in a striking emerald gown. As Miss Marple approached, Dr. Lawson turned, offering a troubled smile. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. I'm afraid our meeting is under rather grim circumstances." Before Dr. Lawson could respond, the young woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with distress. "It's Mr. Charles Pembroke," she exclaimed, her voice wavering. He's been found unconscious near the dining car and I fear the worst." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Miss Marple's mind began to sift through possibilities, her keen intuition sensing that this was no ordinary incident. She glanced around, noting the anxious faces and subtle tensions among the passengers. Each person seemed to hold their own secrets, their own motives. "Unconscious, you say?" Miss Marple mused aloud. "Has anyone attempted to assist him?" Dr. Lawson nodded. "We've called for the train's doctor, but he hasn't arrived yet. It's quite alarming." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Let us hope he is simply ill. In the meantime, perhaps we can all offer some assistance." As they waited for the medical professional, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this incident than met the eye. Her sharp eyes took in the surroundings, the poised Mrs. Pembroke, whose flawless makeup and calm demeanour contrasted sharply with the chaos around her, the tense man clutching his newspaper, the restless children, and the other passengers who now eyed each other with suspicion. Her thoughts wandered to the contents of her notebook, where she habitually jotted down observations. The conductor's nervous glance, Mrs. Pembroke's composed exterior, the man's rigid posture, all were pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Miss Marple's curiosity was a powerful driver, and she felt a familiar excitement at the prospect of unraveling the mystery. As the train hurtled through the countryside, the hours stretched long, each minute adding to the tension aboard the Silver Line Express. Miss Marple engaged in polite conversation with Dr. Lawson and Mrs. Pembroke, her questions subtle yet probing. She noted the way Mrs. Pembroke's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, and the fleeting glances exchanged between the stern man and the rest of the passengers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train approached the next station. Police officers, uniformed and authoritative, boarded promptly, their presence a stark reminder of the severity of the situation. Inspector Collins, a methodical man with a stern demeanour, approached Miss Marple and Dr. Lawson. "Miss Marple, Dr. Lawson, we appreciate your cooperation," he began. "We're here to secure the area and begin our investigation." Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "Of course, Inspector, if there's anything I can assist with, please do not hesitate to ask." Inspector Collins nodded appreciatively. "We've been informed that Mr. Pembroke was found with signs of poisoning. We'll need to speak to all passengers and examine the food he consumed." As the police began their inquiries, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind abuzz with questions. Poison in the food suggested premeditation, but who among the passengers had both the motive and the opportunity? Her initial thoughts leaned toward the kitchen staff, the cook, and the waiter, but if the entire family had consumed the same meal, their motives seemed muddled. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to settle for the obvious. She glanced toward the stern man in the newspaper, recalling her brief observation of his tense demeanour. His relationship with Mr. Pembroke, as she had heard from hushed conversations, had soured recently due to business losses. Could personal vendetta have driven him to such lengths? As the train resumed its journey, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle laid before her. The next 7 or 8 hours would be crucial, filled with observations and subtle deductions. She made a silent promise to herself to uncover the truth behind Mr. Pembroke's sudden demise, confident that her sharp observation and understanding of human nature would illuminate the dark corners of this unfolding mystery. With a final glance out the window at the passing countryside, Miss Marple settled back into her seat, her notebook ready, and awaited the continuation of this fateful journey. Chapter 2. The Unwell Billionaire. The Silver Line Express resumed its steady rhythm, the clatter of the tracks blending with the low hum of anxious conversations. Miss Marple settled back into her seat, her mind already racing through the possibilities surrounding Mr. Charles Pembroke's sudden collapse. She glanced around the compartment, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, the widowed wife of the fallen billionaire, maintained an air of composed elegance, Her perfectly applied makeup and poised demeanor contrasted sharply with the distress evident in her eyes. Edward and Clara, their children, sat quietly beside her, their youthful faces etched with confusion and fear. Miss Marple decided to engage Mrs. Pembroke in conversation, hoping to glean more information. "Mrs. Pembroke, if you don't mind me asking, how are you holding up?" Mrs. Pembroke offered a weak smile. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Marple. It's been a trying ordeal, but we're managing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I can only imagine. Mr. Pembroke was known to be a formidable businessman. Did he have many adversaries in his line of work?" Margaret sighed softly. "Yes, he was not one to make friends easily. His methods were unconventional, to say the least." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "Unconventional, you say? In what manner?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes briefly meeting her children's before returning to Miss Marple. "He often pushed boundaries to achieve his goals. Some would say he was ruthless." Miss Marple made a mental note of Margaret's words. "A ruthless businessman indeed would have numerous enemies, any of whom might have had a motive to harm him. Yet, with his family also having consumed the same meal, the plot was more complex. As the train continued its journey, Miss Marple observed the other passengers with renewed scrutiny. The man across the aisle, Mr. Arthur Blake, appeared particularly tense. His knuckles whitened around the newspaper, and his eyes darted nervously around the compartment. Miss Marple recalled overhearing fragments of conversation earlier, hinting at a strained relationship between him and Mr. Pembroke. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple decided to speak with Dr. Henry Lawson again. She found him quietly reading a book in the corner of the compartment, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. "Good afternoon, Dr. Lawson," she greeted warmly. "May I join you for a moment?" Dr. Lawson looked up, offering a polite smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. Please have a seat." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "I was wondering, Henry, do you know much about Mr. Pembroke's business dealings? It might help us understand if someone had a motive." Dr. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Pembroke was involved in several high-stakes ventures, some of which were less than legal. He had a reputation for crossing ethical lines to secure his position. Rumors suggested connections to organized crime, though nothing was ever proven." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Connections to organized crime, you say? That certainly widens the list of potential adversaries." Dr. Lawson tapped his finger thoughtfully against his book. "Indeed, and given his ruthless nature, it's likely he left behind more than just business rivals." Miss Marple's mind began to weave the threads together. A ruthless gangster with numerous enemies, a strained friendship with Mr. Arthur Blake, and now the sudden poisoning. There were many avenues to explore. As the afternoon sun began to wane, Miss Marple's attention shifted back to the compartment. She noticed the train's cook and waiter moving about the dining car, their faces etched with concern. Mrs. Agatha Green, the cook, seemed particularly frazzled, her hands trembling as she attended to her duties. Thomas Reed, the waiter, appeared distracted, frequently glancing toward Mr. Blake's cabin. Miss Marple decided to approach them subtly, ensuring her inquiries remained casual. "Good evening, Mrs. Green, Thomas," she greeted them warmly. "I hope you're both managing okay amidst all this commotion." Mrs. Green offered a tight smile. "We're doing our best, Miss Marple. It's been quite stressful." Thomas nodded in agreement, though his eyes remained uneasy. "Yes, it's been a long day." Miss Marple sensed an underlying tension. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. We're all in this together." As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple pondered the interactions. The cook and waiter's nervousness could indicate a hidden agenda, but without concrete evidence, it remained speculation. Her instincts urged her to dig deeper, yet she knew patience was essential. Later that evening, as the train passed through a particularly dense stretch of countryside, Miss Marple found herself alone with Edward and Clara Pembroke. The children, still shaken by their father's condition, sat quietly, their eyes downcast. "Edward, Clara," Miss Marple began gently, "how are you both holding up? Is there anything you'd like to talk about?" Edward, the elder of the two, glanced up hesitantly. "We're scared, Miss Marple. Dad hasn't been himself lately. He was always working late, rarely home." Clara, younger and more expressive, nodded in agreement. "He seemed different, more secretive." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "Sometimes people go through difficult times and may not show it. But it's important to talk about what's troubling them. Do you know if your father had any recent disagreements or arguments?" Edward thought for a moment before replying. "He had a few disagreements with Mr. Blake. They were business partners once, but things went sour recently." Miss Marple's interest was piqued once more. "Business partners, you say? What sort of disagreements were these?" Edward shrugged slightly. "It's complicated. I think it had to do with some bad investments and lost opportunities. Mr. Blake wasn't happy with how things were going." Clara chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. "And sometimes Dad would come home angry. I don't know why." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult for both of you." As Miss Marple left the children to their thoughts, she couldn't help but consider the implications. A falling out between business partners provided a clear motive, yet with the poisoning affecting the entire family, the perpetrator must have had a broader scheme in mind. Her gaze then shifted to Mr. Blake, who remained silent, engrossed once more in his newspaper. The tension between him and Mr. Pembroke was palpable, yet without direct evidence, Miss Marple needed to approach the situation delicately. As night enveloped the train, Miss Marple retreated to her seat, her mind a whirlwind of observations and deductions. The pieces were scattered, each holding potential clues to the mystery. The ruthless businessman, the strained friendship, the nervous kitchen staff, all were integral to the puzzle. She decided to document her thoughts in her notebook, meticulously noting each interaction and observation. Her sharp eye for detail was her greatest asset, allowing her to see connections that others might overlook. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her compartment door. It was Dr. Lawson, his expression troubled. "Miss Marple, may I have a word?" She nodded, gesturing for him to enter. "Of course, Henry. What's troubling you?" Dr. Lawson glanced around before leaning in closer. "I overheard a conversation earlier between Mr. Blake and Mrs. Pembroke. They were arguing about something related to Mr. Pembroke's business dealings. It seemed quite heated." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Did you catch any specifics?" Dr. Lawson shook his head. "No, it was muffled, but it added to my suspicions about Mr. Pembroke's recent activities." Miss Marple considered this new information carefully. "Thank you, Henry. Your insight is most helpful." As Dr. Lawson departed, Miss Marple felt a surge of determination. The truth was veiled in layers of deception and hidden motives, but she was resolute in her pursuit of justice. The next few hours would be crucial, filled with careful observation and subtle questioning. She glanced once more at Mr. Blake, who had now folded his newspaper and seemed ready to retire for the night. Miss Marple decided to keep a closer watch on him, her instincts telling her that he held a significant piece of the puzzle. With the night drawing to a close, Miss Marple settled into her seat, her notebook open and pen poised. The Silver Line Express hummed along the tracks, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain destination. As she gazed out the window at the moonlit countryside, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of purpose. A mystery awaited, and she was determined to uncover its hidden truths, one subtle observation at a time. Chapter 3. Poison on board. The Silver Line Express hummed steadily along the tracks, the rhythmic clatter a constant backdrop to the unfolding drama within its polished compartments. Miss Jane Marple sat thoughtfully by her window seat, her notebook open but momentarily forgotten as she gazed out at the twilight-kissed countryside. The evening had brought a chill, and the warm glow of the compartment provided a comforting contrast to the growing tension aboard the train. As the minutes stretched into hours, the initial shock of Mr. Charles Pembroke's collapse began to give way to a restless unease among the passengers. Whispers floated through the carriage, speculations mingling with apprehension. Miss Marple, ever observant, took note of every furtive glance and hushed conversation, her mind already piecing together the fragments of this perplexing puzzle. Just as she was about to resume her quiet contemplation, the train jolted slightly as it entered a particularly winding section of the track. A sudden commotion erupted near the dining car, drawing Miss Marple's attention once more. The door swung open, and a breathless waiter hurriedly entered, his face pale and eyes wide with alarm. "Miss Marple," he gasped, approaching her table with a nervous glance. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, but there's been another incident." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity fully awakened. "Another incident, you say? What has happened?" The waiter swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Agatha Green, the cook, she's collapsed near the kitchen. It appears she's also been poisoned." A collective gasp echoed through the compartment, the news spreading like wildfire. Miss Marple's heart sank. 2 victims on the same train, both seemingly poisoned through their meals. This was no mere coincidence, it was a deliberate act of malice. Without hesitation, Miss Marple stood gracefully, her calm demeanour masking the surge of determination within her. "We must inform the conductor immediately," she declared, her voice steady. The conductor, a stout man with a ruddy complexion and a furrowed brow, appeared at the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Miss Marple, what's happened?" "Another poisoning," she replied succinctly. "Mrs. Green, the cook, has fallen ill. We need to secure the kitchen and ensure no one else is harmed." The conductor nodded, swiftly summoning the train's doctor. As the medical professional arrived, the passengers retreated to their seats, the atmosphere thick with fear and suspicion. Inspector Collins, a methodical man with a stern demeanour, took charge, his presence commanding the room's attention. Miss Marple approached Inspector Collins, her keen eyes meeting his. "Inspector, it seems our situation is more dire than initially thought. 2 victims, both poisoned through their meals. This suggests a coordinated attempt to cause harm." Inspector Collins sighed, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "Indeed, Miss Marple, if the poison was administered via food, it implies access to the kitchen and knowledge of meal preparations. We must consider who among the passengers has both motive and opportunity." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. "The cook and waiter are obvious suspects, but as you mentioned earlier, the entire family consumed the same meal. Their motives might be intertwined or cover a larger scheme." She glanced toward Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, whose composed exterior now seemed almost inscrutable. Her makeup remained flawless, her demeanour calm despite the chaos surrounding her. Miss Marple sensed that there was more to Mrs. Pembroke than met the eye, her tranquility perhaps concealing deeper emotions. Turning her attention to the stern man across the aisle, Mr. Arthur Blake, Miss Marple recalled the strained relationship between him and Mr. Pembroke. Their recent fallout over business losses could provide a clear motive for revenge. Yet, with the additional poisoning of Mrs. Green, the plot was undeniably more complex. Determined to uncover the truth, Miss Marple decided to engage the cook and waiter once more, their nervous demeanours raising further suspicions. She approached Mrs. Green, who was now being tended to by the doctor, and Thomas Reed, the waiter, whose distracted gaze betrayed his unease. "Mrs. Green, Thomas," Miss Marple greeted them gently. "I'm so sorry for what's happened. If there's anything you'd like to share, perhaps it could help us understand these unfortunate events." Mrs. Green looked up, her eyes filled with fear. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I just prepared the meals as usual. I never intended for anyone to be harmed." Thomas Reed nodded in agreement, though his hands trembled slightly. "It was a normal evening. I was serving the meals and Mrs. Green was in the kitchen. We didn't see anything unusual." Miss Marple studied them closely, her sharp mind picking up subtle cues. Their nervousness seemed genuine, yet their consistent stories raised questions. "Thank you both. Please take care of yourselves." As she left them to their thoughts, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Arthur Blake, who remained silent, his stern expression unchanged. She wondered if his composed exterior masked a simmering resentment, a desire for retribution that could extend beyond his fallout with Mr. Pembroke. Turning back to Inspector Collins, Miss Marple shared her observations. "Inspector, I believe we need to look beyond the immediate suspects. The coordinated poisonings suggest a premeditated act, possibly orchestrated by someone with intricate knowledge of the household and its dynamics." Inspector Collins nodded thoughtfully. "Agreed, Miss Marple. We need to examine everyone's connections to Mr. Pembroke and each other. Someone here has orchestrated this, and it's up to us to uncover who." Miss Marple felt a surge of determination. The presence of a second victim confirmed her suspicions of foul play, and the involvement of the entire family added layers of complexity. She knew that unraveling this mystery would require careful observation and subtle interrogation. As the train continued its journey, the hours dragged on, each minute adding to the mounting tension. Miss Marple engaged in polite conversation with the passengers, her questions subtle yet probing, her eyes ever observant for any sign of deceit or hidden motives. She found herself frequently glancing toward Mr. Arthur Blake, noting his persistent sternness and the occasional flicker of agitation in his eyes. His relationship with Mr. Pembroke, though now seemingly professional, had deep personal undercurrents that could have fueled his motives. Meanwhile, Mrs. Margaret Pembroke maintained her calm, her composed demeanour suggesting a woman well versed in concealing her true emotions. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Pembroke's flawless appearance was a facade masking a more turbulent inner life. As night enveloped the train, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Two poisoned victims, each with their own connections and motives, created a tangled web of deceit that only she could untangle. Her mind buzzed with possibilities, each thread leading to another layer of intrigue. In the quiet of her compartment, Miss Marple penned down her observations, her handwriting neat and precise. The cook and waiter's nervousness, the strained relationship between Blake and Pembroke, the composed facade of Mrs. Pembroke, all were crucial pieces of the puzzle. She resolved to delve deeper, trusting her instincts and her unparalleled ability to read human nature. The truth was hidden somewhere within the compartments of the Silver Line Express, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, one subtle clue at a time. As the train sped onward into the night, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of purpose. The mystery aboard the Silver Line Express was far from over, and she was ready to navigate its intricate twists and turns, confident that her keen observations would ultimately lead to justice. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The Silver Line Express continued its relentless journey through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks a constant reminder of the passage of time. Inside the first-class compartment, tension hung thick in the air, each passenger grappling with the shock of not one, but two poisonings. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained a pillar of calm amidst the chaos, her keen mind already delving deeper into the mystery. After the second victim, Mrs. Agatha Green, the cook, had fallen ill, Miss Marple knew it was time to broaden her investigation beyond the immediate suspects. She recalled the man in the next cabin, a friend of Mr. Pembroke, whose business had recently suffered at his hands. His name was Arthur Blake, a name that now echoed ominously in her thoughts. Miss Marple decided to approach Mr. Blake directly, her gentle demeanour masking the intensity of her curiosity. She found him in his cabin, hunched over a newspaper, the corners of his mouth pressed into a thin line of frustration. "Mr. Blake," she began softly, knocking lightly on the doorframe. "May I have a word?" Arthur looked up, surprise flickering across his stern features. "Miss Marple, of course. Please come in." She stepped inside, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of empathy and determination. "I understand that you and Mr. Pembroke were once close friends. I'm sorry to hear that things have taken a sour turn between you two." Arthur sighed deeply, running a hand through his greying hair. "Yes, our business partnership dissolved recently. Mr. Pembroke was relentless, pushing boundaries that left many of us in difficult positions." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Such disagreements can strain even the strongest of friendships. May I ask if there were any personal grievances beyond the professional ones?" Arthur hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Mr. Pembroke wasn't a man to forgive easily. He made enemies wherever he went, both in business and otherwise. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Enemies often hold grudges that fester over time. Did Mr. Pembroke have any particular adversaries you're aware of?" Arthur's eyes met hers again, a flicker of bitterness evident. "He was involved in some unsavory dealings. There were rumors about his connections to organized crime, but nothing was ever proven." Miss Marple absorbed his words, her mind already weaving connections. Connections to organized crime could provide a vast array of motives. It's unfortunate that such ties often lead to violence and deceit. Arthur nodded, his expression shadowed by memories. Indeed, Mr. Pembroke wasn't one to play nice. He did a lot of damage to people's lives, often without remorse. As Miss Marple left Arthur's cabin, her thoughts churned with the implications of his words. A ruthless businessman with ties to organized crime, this added layers of complexity to the case. She needed to explore these connections further, but discreetly, to avoid alarming the other passengers or tipping off potential suspects. Returning to her compartment, Miss Marple decided to focus her attention on another key figure, the train's conductor, Samuel Turner. She had noticed his quiet efficiency and the way he moved through the carriages with a detached grace. There was something about his demeanour that suggested a man accustomed to maintaining order, yet perhaps hiding his own secrets. During the next meal service, Miss Marple found an opportunity to speak with Mr. Turner. As he served drinks with practiced precision, she struck up a conversation. "Mr. Turner?" she began warmly. "You do a splendid job managing the train. It must require a great deal of skill and patience." He offered a polite smile, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a demanding job, but I take pride in keeping everything running smoothly." Miss Marple nodded appreciatively. "I can imagine. Such responsibility must require a keen eye for detail. Have you ever encountered any unusual situations on your journeys?" Samuel hesitated for a moment before responding. "Not particularly unusual, just the regular mix of passengers and the occasional delay. Although, last year there was an incident with a passenger who caused quite a stir, but that was handled swiftly." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with curiosity. It's always interesting to hear about the various stories that unfold on a train. Each journey is like a microcosm of society, don't you think? Samuel chuckled softly. Indeed it is. People from all walks of life come together, if only for a few hours. Miss Marple sensed there was more beneath his calm exterior. Yes, and sometimes those brief encounters reveal unexpected truths. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Turner. It's always fascinating to hear different perspectives. As the conversation ended, Miss Marple felt a pang of suspicion. There was a guardedness in Samuel's demeanor, a reluctance to delve too deeply into personal matters. She made a mental note to observe him more closely, wondering if his role as conductor granted him access to information or places others could not reach. With her focus now shifting to uncovering the broader network of connections surrounding Mr. Pembroke, Miss Marple began to piece together the intricate web of relationships. She recalled the cook's and waiter's nervousness, Arthur Blake's bitterness, and now the enigmatic conductor's reserved nature. Each interaction added another layer to the unfolding mystery. Determined to find the hidden connections, Miss Marple decided to revisit her initial observations. She noted that both victims had consumed the same meal, suggesting a shared method of poisoning. However, the inclusion of the entire family complicated the motive. If it were a targeted act, why include the innocent children and a composed wife? Her thoughts turned to the possibility of a collective vendetta. If Mr. Pembroke had wronged multiple individuals, perhaps they had conspired to eliminate him in a way that also impacted those closely associated with him. This would explain why the poison affected everyone who partook in the meal. Miss Marple's sharp mind began to sift through the clues. Mr. Pembroke's ruthless nature had undoubtedly left many enemies, but only a select few would go so far as to collaborate in such a scheme. The cook and waiter's nervousness hinted at their possible involvement, or at least their awareness of the plot. Arthur Blake's resentment provided a clear personal motive, while Samuel Turner's detached professionalism suggested he might have access to the means or information needed to execute the plan. As the train neared its next station, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle aligning. The orchestrated nature of the poisonings indicated a premeditated act, meticulously planned to ensure Mr. Pembroke's demise while inadvertently implicating others. The question remained, who among them had the motive, opportunity, and means to carry out such a deed? With the station just hours away, Miss Marple knew time was of the essence. She decided to document her findings meticulously, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Her notebook became a repository of observations, connections, and potential motives, each entry bringing her closer to unraveling the truth. As midnight approached and the train glided through the silent countryside, Miss Marple sat quietly, her mind a whirlwind of deductions and possibilities. The secrets beneath the surface were beginning to emerge, and she was determined to uncover the hidden truths that bound these passengers together in this tragic tableau. The next chapter of her investigation would require careful navigation of human emotions and concealed agendas. Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of delving deeper into the hearts and minds of those aboard the Silver Line Express, confident that her unwavering attention to detail would illuminate the path to justice. Chapter 5. The Web of Deceit. The Silver Line Express continued its relentless journey through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks providing a constant backdrop to the unfolding drama within its polished compartments. Miss Jane Marple, ever the epitome of calm, sat thoughtfully by her window seat, her notebook open, but momentarily forgotten as she gazed out at the moonlit countryside. The train hurtled forward, carrying its passengers deeper into the unknown, both geographically and metaphorically. As the minutes ticked by, The initial shock of Mr. Charles Pembroke's collapse had given way to a restless unease among the passengers. Whispers floated through the compartment, mingling with apprehension and suspicion. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every subtle interaction that might hold the key to unraveling the mystery. After the second victim, Mrs. Agatha Green, the cook, had fallen ill, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Inspector Collins, a methodical man with a stern demeanour, had taken charge, methodically questioning passengers and securing the dining car. Miss Marple knew it was time to broaden her investigation beyond the immediate suspects. She recalled her conversation with Mr. Arthur Blake, the estranged friend and business partner whose relationship with Mr. Pembroke had recently soured. His presence on the train now seemed even more significant. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple approached Dr. Henry Lawson once more. She found him quietly reading a book in the corner of the compartment, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. "Good evening, Henry," she greeted warmly. "May I join you for a moment?" Dr. Lawson looked up, offering a polite smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. What's on your mind?" Miss Marple took a seat opposite him, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "I've been pondering Mr. Pembroke's business dealings. You mentioned earlier that he had connections to organized crime. Do you know any more about that?" Dr. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Pembroke was involved in several high-stakes ventures, some of which were less than legal. He had a reputation for crossing ethical lines to secure his position. Rumors suggested connections to less reputable individuals, perhaps even criminal organizations, though nothing was ever proven. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Connections like these could certainly create a network of enemies. It makes me wonder if there are others aboard this train who had reasons to harm him. Dr. Lawson tapped his pen against his notebook. "Indeed, it's likely that Mr. Pembroke had enemies from various spheres, but without concrete evidence, it's hard to pinpoint who among us could have the motive and opportunity." Miss Marple considered this, her mind already forming connections. "Thank you, Henry. Your insight is most helpful." As she left Dr. Lawson to his notes, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cook, Mrs. Agatha Green, and the waiter, Thomas Reed. Their nervous demeanours suggested they might be more involved than mere kitchen staff caught in a tragedy. Deciding to revisit them, Miss Marple approached the dining car. Mrs. Green was being tended to by the train's doctor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Thomas Reed, however, seemed slightly more composed, though Miss Marple could see the lingering unease in his eyes. "Thomas," Miss Marple greeted softly, sitting beside him. "I wanted to check on you. How are you holding up?" Thomas gave a small, strained smile. "I'm managing, Miss Marple. It's been quite a night." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine. If there's anything you'd like to share, anything at all, please feel free." Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting briefly around the compartment before settling back on Miss Marple. "Well, I did overhear something earlier, something about Mr. Pembroke's past." Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. "Do tell." Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers nervously twisting a napkin. "I've heard rumours that Mr. Pembroke was involved in some dark dealings. It's said he had connections to a man named Victor Lane, a gangster who was responsible for the death of his own brother. Some say Mr. Pembroke was involved in that killing, either directly or indirectly." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind racing through the implications. "Victor Lane, you say? That certainly adds a layer of complexity. And how does this relate to our current predicament?" Thomas looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the compartment door as if fearing overhearing ears. "I heard that Mr. Pembroke and Mr. Blake had a falling out because of Victor Lane. It was said that Mr. Blake lost a significant business deal due to Mr. Pembroke's ruthless tactics, which were influenced by his ties with Lane. Miss Marple absorbed his words, her thoughts connecting the dots. So, Mr. Blake stands to gain from Mr. Pembroke's downfall. That's quite significant. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. And there's more. Mrs. Green and I had a disagreement recently. It wasn't anything major, just about the kitchen supplies. But after that, Mr. Pembroke was particularly harsh with her. She seemed more stressed than usual. Miss Marple considered this. Stress can certainly lead to tense interactions, but does Mrs. Green have any connection to Victor Lane or Mr. Pembroke's past actions? Thomas shook his head. Not that I'm aware of. She's always been professional, despite the pressures of the kitchen. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Thomas. Your honesty is appreciated. As Miss Marple left him, she felt a surge of understanding. The connections between Mr. Pembroke, Mr. Blake, and Victor Lane created a web of motives and potential motives that now extended beyond the immediate suspects. The cook's stress could be a red herring or a subtle clue pointing toward deeper involvement. Her mind now turned to the other possible connections aboard the train. She considered the enigmatic conductor, Samuel Turner, whose guarded demeanor had aroused her suspicion. Could his personal history intertwine with Victor Lane or Mr. Pembroke's actions? It was a possibility worth exploring. Miss Marple decided to approach Mr. Turner once more, this time with a more direct line of questioning. She found him at his post arranging the seating in the dining car with a detached efficiency. She caught his attention with a polite greeting. "Good evening, Mr. Turner," she began. "I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk." Samuel Turner offered a polite, yet reserved smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. How can I assist you?" Miss Marple sat beside him, her gaze steady. "I've been trying to understand the dynamics among the passengers. Given Mr. Pembroke's past and the recent incidents, I believe there might be more beneath the surface. Do you happen to know anything about Victor Lane or any connections Mr. Pembroke might have had with him?" Samuel hesitated, his smile faltering slightly. "Victor Lane? I'm afraid I don't know much about him. My interactions with Mr. Pembroke were strictly professional. We didn't socialize outside of work." Miss Marple nodded, sensing his guardedness. "I see. Sometimes professional relationships can mask deeper connections. If you do recall anything, no matter how small, it could be helpful." Samuel maintained his composure, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tension in his jaw. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Marple. If anything comes to mind, I'll be sure to inform you." As she left him to his duties, Miss Marple felt a pang of frustration. Samuel's evasiveness suggested he might be hiding something, but without concrete evidence, it remained speculation. She knew she had to tread carefully, ensuring she didn't alienate him or raise his suspicions. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The connections between Mr. Pembroke, Mr. Blake, and Victor Lane hinted at a far-reaching network of deceit and potential revenge. Each suspect's motive was now layered with past grievances and hidden vendettas, making the puzzle increasingly complex. Her thoughts then turned to the train's layout. The Silver Line Express was equipped with numerous compartments and hidden passages, remnants of its older design. Could the murderer have used such a passage to execute the poisonings without being seen? It was a possibility that Miss Marple found intriguing. With the next station drawing closer, Miss Marple knew that time was running short. She needed to consolidate her findings and consider the possible connections that tied the suspects together. The orchestrated nature of the poisoning suggested that all involved had carefully planned this event, possibly waiting for the right moment to act. Miss Marple decided to document her findings meticulously, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Her notebook became a repository of observations, connections, and potential motives, each entry bringing her closer to unraveling the truth. She jotted down the strained relationship between Blake and Pembroke, the cook's nervousness, Thomas Reed's uncomfortable revelations, and the enigmatic conductor's guarded responses. As the train approached the next station, Miss Marple felt a sense of urgency. The arrival of the police would bring a new phase to the investigation, but she was determined to uncover as much as she could before that happened. The interconnected motives and the orchestrated nature of the poisonings hinted at a complex conspiracy, one that would require all of her observational prowess and deductive reasoning to unravel. With the station just hours away, Miss Marple knew she needed to act quickly. She resolved to focus her attention on those with the most to gain from Mr. Pembroke's demise. Mr. Arthur Blake, with his recent fallout, and Samuel Turner, with his guarded demeanor, were top of her list. Additionally, the cook and waiter's nervousness suggested they might have more to hide than they let on. As the train neared the next station, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle aligning. The orchestrated nature of the poisonings indicated a planned act of retribution, perhaps targeting not just Mr. Pembroke, but anyone associated with his ruthless business practices. The cook and waiter's interactions hinted at internal tensions, while Mr. Blake's bitterness suggested a personal vendetta. Samuel Turner's mysterious past added another layer of intrigue. With each passing moment, Miss Marple's understanding deepened. The truth was hidden in the intricate web of relationships aboard the Silver Line Express, and she was determined to uncover it. Her keen observations and methodical deductions were her greatest tools, guiding her through the maze of deceit and hidden motives. As midnight approached and the train glided through the silent countryside, Miss Marple sat quietly, her mind a whirlwind of deductions and possibilities. The secrets beneath the surface were beginning to emerge, and she was ready to navigate the intricate web of deceit that had brought them all together in this tragic tableau. The next chapter of her investigation would require careful navigation of human emotions and concealed agendas. Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of delving deeper into the hearts and minds of those aboard the Silver Line Express, confident that her unwavering attention to detail would illuminate the path to justice. Chapter 6. Clues in the Shadows. The Silver Line Express rolled steadily through the night, the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a velvet curtain. Inside, the compartment buzzed with subdued tension, each passenger lost in their own turmoil, following the tragic poisonings of Mr. Pembroke and Mrs. Green. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained a beacon of calm, her mind a hive of activity as she meticulously pieced together the fragments of the unfolding mystery. After her conversations with Mr. Arthur Blake and the timid revelations from Thomas Reed, Miss Marple felt the weight of the connections she was uncovering. The strained business relationship between Blake and Pembroke, coupled with the cook's and waiter's uneasy demeanors, hinted at deeper undercurrents of resentment and potential motives. Yet, the poisoning of Mrs. Green suggested that the plot was far more intricate than a simple act of revenge. Determined to delve deeper, Miss Marple decided to revisit the compartment's layout and the interactions she had observed earlier. The train's older design featured numerous hidden passages and secluded nooks, remnants of a bygone era. Such architectural features could provide perfect avenues for clandestine meetings or the discreet exchange of information, and perhaps even the concealment of malevolent acts. As she sat back in her seat, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the compartment once more, her sharp gaze noting every detail. She recalled seeing Mr. Samuel Turner, the conductor, moving silently through the carriages, his presence almost ghost-like in its subtlety. His guarded demeanor and the slight tremor in his hands during their previous conversation suggested he might be hiding something crucial. Miss Marple decided it was time to approach him again, this time with a more direct line of inquiry. She waited until he was momentarily alone, arranging seating in the dining car, before making her presence known. "Mr. Turner?" she began softly, her voice steady and inviting. "Might I have a word with you?" Samuel Turner paused, his expression polite but cautious. "Of course, Miss Marple, how can I assist you?" She settled beside him, maintaining eye contact with a warmth that belied her probing intent. "I've been reflecting on the recent events aboard the train, and I can't help but feel there are layers yet to be uncovered. Your role as conductor places you in a unique position, overseeing all aspects of the journey. Have you noticed anything unusual or out of the ordinary since Mr. Pembroke's unfortunate condition?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes briefly flickering toward the door, as if searching for an escape. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Miss Marple. Just the usual ebb and flow of passengers and their routines." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand that the train operates smoothly, but sometimes the most subtle changes can be telling. For instance, have you observed any unusual behavior among the passengers, or perhaps any strange occurrences in the compartment areas?" Samuel swallowed, his composure wavering for a split second. Well, there was that incident a while back with Victor Lane. He was quite a handful, causing disruptions until you intervened. Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. "Victor Lane, you say? I recall Mr. Pembroke mentioning his name in conversation earlier. Can you tell me more about your interactions with him?" Samuel's expression darkened slightly, a shadow crossing his features. "Victor was a troublesome passenger, always seeking trouble. Our interactions were strictly professional. Nothing beyond that." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And what about any connections Victor Lane might have had outside of this train? Any associates or business ties that could shed light on his presence here?" Samuel glanced away, his jaw tightening. "Victor had his own set of business dealings, nothing directly related to Mr. Pembroke. They were competitors in certain ventures, but I can't say there was any significant conflict beyond that." Miss Marple sensed a reluctance to divulge more information, but pressed gently. "Sometimes connections are more intricate than they appear on the surface. If you do recall anything else, no matter how small, it could prove invaluable." Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Victor was a persistent man, always pushing boundaries. He had a knack for stirring things up, which made him difficult to manage. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. Your insights are most helpful. If there's anything else you think of, please do let me know." As she left him to his duties, Miss Marple felt a surge of clarity. Victor Lane's presence and his interactions with Mr. Pembroke suggested a history of rivalry and conflict, further complicating the web of motives. But why had Victor been on this particular train? And what role did he play in the current tragedy? Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mrs. Margaret Pembroke. Her composed exterior and flawless makeup masked the turmoil within, and Miss Marple suspected that there were deeper layers to her character. Perhaps Margaret held secrets or harbored grievances that could shed light on her husband's demise. She approached Mrs. Pembroke quietly, ensuring she wouldn't disturb the other passengers. "Mrs. Pembroke," she began gently, "if you don't mind me asking, how are you coping with everything that's happened?" Margaret offered a small, weary smile. "It's been difficult, Miss Marple. Mr. Pembroke was a strong man, but these events have been overwhelming." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I can only imagine. Have you noticed any changes in Mr. Pembroke's behavior recently? Anything unusual that might help us understand what led to this unfortunate incident?" Margaret paused, her eyes reflecting a hint of sadness. Mr. Pembroke was always dedicated to his work, but lately he seemed more preoccupied than usual. He would often stay late, and I sensed he was dealing with some business troubles. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Business troubles can certainly take a toll. Did he confide in you about any specific issues or concerns? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, he kept his worries to himself. I respected his privacy, though it made me worry. Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. It's important to support one another during tough times. If you ever feel the need to talk, I'm here to listen. As she departed, Miss Marple felt a growing sense of connection with Margaret. The veil of composure might be hiding deeper emotions, and understanding those emotions could be key to unraveling the mystery. Her thoughts then turned to the children, Edward and Clara. Their innocent eyes and quiet demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them. Miss Marple wondered if they had noticed anything unusual, or if they held any subconscious clues that could aid in the investigation. Later that night, as the train sped through the silent countryside, Miss Marple found herself alone with Edward and Clara in their compartment. The children sat quietly, their youthful innocence a stark contrast to the dark events unfolding around them. Edward, Clara? Miss Marple began softly. How are you both holding up? Is there anything you'd like to share about what's been happening? Edward, the older of the two, glanced up hesitantly. We're scared, Miss Marple. Dad hasn't been himself lately. He was always working late, rarely home. Clara nodded, her eyes downcast. He seemed different, more secretive. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. Sometimes people go through difficult times and may not show it, but it's important to talk about what's troubling them. Do you know if your father had any recent disagreements or arguments? Edward thought for a moment before replying. He had a few disagreements with Mr. Blake. They were business partners once, but things went sour recently. Clara chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. And sometimes Dad would come home angry. I don't know why. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult for both of you. As she left the children to their thoughts, Miss Marple couldn't help but consider the implications. A falling out between business partners provided a clear motive, yet with the additional poisoning of Mrs. Green, the perpetrator must have had a broader scheme in mind. Her gaze then shifted to the man across the aisle, Mr. Arthur Blake, who remained silent, engrossed once more in his newspaper. The tension between him and Mr. Pembroke was palpable, yet without direct evidence, Miss Marple needed to approach the situation delicately. As midnight approached and the train continued its journey, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle aligning. The orchestrated nature of the poisonings suggested a planned act of retribution, possibly targeting not just Mr. Pembroke, but anyone associated with his ruthless business practices. The cook and waiter's interactions hinted at internal tensions, while Mr. Blake's bitterness suggested a personal vendetta. Samuel Turner's mysterious past added another layer of intrigue. With the next station drawing closer, Miss Marple knew time was running short. She needed to consolidate her findings and consider the possible connections that tied the suspects together. The orchestrated nature of the poisonings indicated a complex conspiracy, one that would require all of her observational prowess and deductive reasoning to unravel. As the train hurtled toward the next station, Miss Marple felt a sense of urgency. The arrival of the police would bring a new phase to the investigation, but she was determined to uncover as much as she could before that happened. The interconnected motives and the orchestrated nature of the poisonings hinted at a deeper plot, possibly involving multiple conspirators working in unison. With the station just hours away, Miss Marple knew she needed to act quickly. She resolved to focus her attention on those with the most to gain from Mr. Pembroke's demise. Mr. Arthur Blake, with his recent fallout, and Samuel Turner, with his guarded demeanour, were top of her list. Additionally, the cook and waiter's nervousness suggested they might have more to hide than they let on. As the train approached the next station, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle aligning. The orchestrated nature of the poisonings indicated a premeditated act, meticulously planned to ensure Mr. Pembroke's demise while inadvertently implicating others. The cook and waiter's interactions hinted at internal tensions, while Mr. Blake's bitterness suggested a personal vendetta. Samuel Turner's mysterious past added another layer of intrigue. With each passing moment, Miss Marple's understanding deepened. The truth was hidden in the intricate web of relationships aboard the Silverline Express, and she was determined to uncover it. Her keen observations and methodical deductions were her greatest tools, guiding her through the maze of deceit and hidden motives. As the train neared the next station, Miss Marple felt a sense of urgency. The arrival of the police would bring new questions and possibly unravel parts of her carefully constructed deductions. She needed to ensure that her conclusions were sound, her suspicions well-founded, before the authorities intervened. With the final stretch of the journey before her, Miss Marple sat quietly, her mind a whirlwind of deductions and possibilities. The secrets beneath the surface were beginning to emerge, and she was ready to navigate the intricate web of deceit that had brought them all together in this tragic tableau. The next chapter of her investigation would require careful navigation of human emotions and concealed agendas. Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of delving deeper into the hearts and minds of those aboard the Silverline Express, confident that her unwavering attention to detail would illuminate the path to justice. Chapter 7. The Unraveling Web. The Silverline Express glided smoothly through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks providing a steady backdrop to the mounting tension within its first-class compartments. Miss Jane Marple sat poised and composed, her notebook now brimming with observations and deductions. The tragic poisonings of Mr. Charles Pembroke and Mrs. Agatha Green had transformed the serene journey into a labyrinth of secrets and suspicions. As the hours passed, Miss Marple meticulously reviewed her notes, connecting the dots between the strained business relationship of Mr. Arthur Blake, the nervousness of the kitchen staff, and the enigmatic demeanour of Mr. Samuel Turner, the conductor. Each interaction, each subtle gesture, had woven itself into a complex tapestry of potential motives and hidden agendas. Deciding that the time had come to address the gathered passengers, Miss Marple requested a meeting in the elegant lounge car. The conductor, sensing her authority, arranged for the group to convene in a spacious area adorned with plush seating and softly lit chandeliers. As the passengers assembled, the atmosphere thickened with unease and anticipation. Miss Marple stood gracefully at the front, her demeanour calm, yet commanding. She began, her voice steady and soothing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your cooperation during these distressing times. While the authorities are conducting their investigation, I believe it may be beneficial for us to share our observations and concerns." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Miss Marple's presence was both reassuring and authoritative, a combination that encouraged openness among the anxious passengers. "I have been quietly observing our interactions and the circumstances surrounding Mr. Pembroke's unfortunate condition," she continued. "It is clear that this was no mere accident, but a deliberate act of malice. To uncover the truth, we must examine the connections and motives that each of us may hold." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, her sharp eyes meeting each face in the room. "Let us begin by considering access and opportunity." The poison was administered through the shared meal, suggesting that the perpetrator had direct access to the kitchen or the means to tamper with the food discreetly. All eyes turned toward Mrs. Agatha Green and Thomas Reed, the cook and waiter, whose previously nervous demeanours now seemed more pronounced. Miss Marple gave them a reassuring nod, though her gaze remained penetrating. Mrs. Green and Mr. Reed, you both had the opportunity to influence the meal preparation. However, considering that the entire family consumed the same meal, it complicates the motive. A collective sigh escaped the passengers, but Miss Marple was not deterred. This indicates that the motive might extend beyond personal grievances, potentially pointing to a larger scheme aimed at Mr. Pembroke's elimination. Let us now consider personal motives. Mr. Arthur Blake, your recent fallout with Mr. Pembroke is well known. Such a strained relationship often breeds resentment. Mr. Blake, his stern visage betraying no emotion, nodded curtly. That's correct. Our business disagreements were purely professional, nothing more. Miss Marple acknowledged his statement with a slight bow. I understand, Mr. Blake. However, professional conflicts can sometimes escalate into personal vendettas, especially in high-stakes environments. Her attention then shifted to Mr. Samuel Turner, the conductor. Mr. Turner, as the conductor, you oversee the smooth operation of this journey. Have you noticed anything unusual or out of the ordinary since Mr. Pembroke's condition? Samuel hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting Miss Marple's before darting away. Nothing that I can say, Miss Marple. Everything has been as usual. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Turner. Your role undoubtedly places you in a unique position to observe the dynamics of our journey. She then turned her gaze to Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, whose composed exterior seemed almost too perfect in the face of tragedy. Mrs. Pembroke, your grace during this ordeal is commendable. However, sometimes those who remain outwardly calm may be concealing deeper emotions or motives. Margaret offered a small, weary smile. Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle, yet probing. Indeed. And what of the children, Edward and Clara? Have you noticed any changes in their behaviour, or any signs of distress beyond the immediate circumstances? Edward and Clara glanced at each other before responding in unison, their voices tinged with fear. We're scared, Miss Marple. Dad wasn't himself lately. He was always working late and seemed troubled. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. It's important to support one another during such times. Sometimes children pick up on tensions that adults might overlook. As the meeting progressed, Miss Marple skillfully guided the conversation, encouraging each passenger to share their perspectives, while subtly highlighting inconsistencies and potential motives. The room buzzed with tension, suspicion subtly shifting from one person to another, each revelation adding another layer to the intricate puzzle. Just as the discussion reached a peak, Miss Marple's keen eye caught a glimmer of something unusual, a unique piece of jewellery adorning the wrist of one of the passengers. It was an elegant brooch, intricately designed, bearing an insignia that seemed oddly familiar. Her mind raced as she recognized the emblem, a symbol tied to a clandestine group known for their involvement in high-stakes business and underhanded dealings. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on the bearer of the brooch, a woman seated quietly in the corner of the lounge car. The woman, previously unobtrusive, now seemed to hold a secret too heavy to bear. Miss Marple approached her gracefully, her presence both calming and commanding. "Pardon me, miss," she began softly, gesturing to the brooch. "That is a beautiful piece of jewellery. The insignia, it looks remarkably like something I've seen before. May I inquire about its significance?" The woman looked up, her eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "Oh, this? It's just a family heirloom. Nothing of particular note." Miss Marple smiled gently. Family heirlooms often carry deep sentimental value, sometimes even connections to our past. It's fascinating how certain symbols can evoke memories and histories. The woman nodded, her composure unbroken. Yes, it's been passed down through generations. A cherished keepsake, really. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. Indeed, sometimes these symbols can reveal hidden affiliations or loyalties that may not be immediately apparent. With that, Miss Marple returned to the group, her mind now piecing together the significance of the brooch. The insignia was a critical clue, linking the wearer to a network that could potentially have motives rooted in deep-seated grudges and hidden agendas. As the train continued its journey, the tension in the lounge car remained palpable. Miss Marple's subtle probing had intensified the suspicions, yet the true culprit remained elusive. The unique brooch had provided a tantalizing hint, a piece of the puzzle that pointed toward a darker, more intricate motive. She knew that the next steps would require careful navigation, balancing her role as an observer with the need to uncover the truth. The arrival of the police at the next station would complicate matters, but Miss Marple was determined to ensure that all the pieces of the puzzle were in place before the final revelation. As midnight deepened, Miss Marple felt the threads of deceit and hidden motives intertwining, leading her ever closer to the heart of the mystery. The brooch, the strained relationships, and the orchestrated poisonings had woven a web that only her sharp mind could unravel. With each passing moment, she moved one step closer to unveiling the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of the Silver Line Express. Chapter 8. The Grand Revelation. The Silver Line Express began to slow as dawn approached, the first light of day casting a pale glow over the countryside. Inside the compartment, tension hung thick in the air, every passenger awaiting the arrival of the police with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her mind abuzz with the intricate web of observations and deductions that had led her to the heart of the mystery aboard the train. Throughout the journey, Miss Marple had meticulously pieced together the puzzle surrounding Mr. Charles Pembroke's untimely death. The billionaire's ruthless nature had left a trail of enemies, each with their own motives for wanting him gone. Her initial suspicions had fallen on the cook and the waiter, whose nervous demeanors suggested hidden tensions. However, as she delved deeper, she uncovered connections that pointed to a more intricate web of deceit involving multiple passengers. Miss Marple recalled her conversations with Dr. Henry Lawson, who had revealed Mr. Pembroke's ties to organized crime and his involvement in the tragic death of Victor Lane's brother. The strained relationship between Mr. Pembroke and Arthur Blake, once a close friend turned bitter adversary, added another layer of complexity. Moreover, the enigmatic presence of the conductor, Samuel Turner, with his reserved demeanor, hinted at secrets that could potentially unravel the entire mystery. As the train neared the next station, Miss Marple felt a surge of clarity. The key to solving the mystery lay in understanding the intricate relationships and hidden motives that bound the passengers together. Each clue she had gathered pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate Mr. Pembroke, ensuring that no loose ends remained. Determined to confront the truth, Miss Marple decided to address the gathered passengers one final time before the police arrived. She rose gracefully, her calm demeanor commanding attention as she stood before the group in the lounge car. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and soothing, "I appreciate your cooperation during these distressing times. While the authorities are conducting their investigation, I believe it may be beneficial for us to share our observations and concerns." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Miss Marple's presence was both reassuring and authoritative, a combination that encouraged openness among the anxious passengers. I have been quietly observing our interactions and the circumstances surrounding Mr. Pembroke's unfortunate condition," she continued. "It is clear that this was no mere accident but a deliberate act of malice. To uncover the truth, we must examine the connections and motives that each of us may hold." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, her sharp eyes meeting each face in the room. "Let us begin by considering access and opportunity. The poison was administered through the shared meal, suggesting that the perpetrators had direct access to the kitchen or the means to tamper with the food discreetly." All eyes turned toward Mrs. Agatha Green and Thomas Reed, the cook and waiter, whose previously nervous demeanours now seemed more pronounced. Miss Marple gave them a reassuring nod, though her gaze remained penetrating. "Mrs. Green and Mr. Reed, you both had the opportunity to influence the meal preparation. However, considering that the entire family consumed the same meal, the motive must extend beyond personal grievances, potentially pointing to a larger scheme aimed at Mr. Pembroke's elimination." A collective sigh escaped the passengers, but Miss Marple was not deterred. This indicates that the motive might involve a coordinated effort to ensure Mr. Pembroke's permanent removal. Let us now consider personal motives. Mr. Arthur Blake, your recent fallout with Mr. Pembroke is well known. Such a strained relationship often breeds resentment. Mr. Blake, his stern visage betraying no emotion, nodded curtly. "That's correct. Our business disagreements were purely professional, nothing more." Miss Marple acknowledged his statement with a slight bow. "I understand, Mr. Blake. However, professional conflicts can sometimes escalate into personal vendettas, especially in high-stakes environments." Her attention then shifted to Mr. Samuel Turner, the conductor. "Mr. Turner, as the conductor, you oversee the smooth operation of this journey. Have you noticed anything unusual or out of the ordinary since Mr. Pembroke's condition?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting Miss Marple's before darting away. "Nothing that I can say, Miss Marple. Everything has been as usual." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. Your role undoubtedly places you in a unique position to observe the dynamics of our journey." She then turned her gaze to Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, whose composed exterior seemed almost too perfect in the face of tragedy. "Mrs. Pembroke, your grace during this ordeal is commendable. However, sometimes those who remain outwardly calm may be concealing deeper emotions or motives." Margaret offered a small, weary smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been a difficult time for all of us." Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle yet probing. "Indeed. And what of the children, Edward and Clara? Have you noticed any changes in their behaviour, or any signs of distress beyond the immediate circumstances?" Edward and Clara glanced at each other before responding in unison, their voices tinged with fear. "We're scared, Miss Marple. Dad wasn't himself lately. He was always working late and seemed troubled." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's important to support one another during such times. Sometimes children pick up on tensions that adults might overlook." As the meeting progressed, Miss Marple skillfully guided the conversation, encouraging each passenger to share their perspectives while subtly highlighting inconsistencies and potential motives. The room buzzed with tension, suspicions subtly shifting from one person to another, each revelation adding another layer to the intricate puzzle. Just as the discussion reached a peak, Miss Marple's keen eye caught a glimmer of something unusual, a unique piece of jewellery adorning the wrist of one of the passengers. It was an elegant brooch, intricately designed, bearing an insignia that seemed oddly familiar. Her mind raced as she recognized the emblem, a symbol tied to a clandestine group known for their involvement in high-stakes business and underhanded dealings. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on the bearer of the brooch, a woman seated quietly in the corner of the lounge car. The woman, previously unobtrusive, now seemed to hold a secret too heavy to bear. Miss Marple approached her gracefully, her presence both calming and commanding. "Pardon me, miss," she began softly, gesturing to the brooch. "That is a beautiful piece of jewellery. The insignia, it looks remarkably like something I've seen before. May I inquire about its significance?" The woman looked up, her eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "Oh, this? It's just a family heirloom, nothing of particular note." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Family heirlooms often carry deep sentimental value, sometimes even connections to our past. It's fascinating how certain symbols can evoke memories and histories." The woman nodded, her composure unbroken. "Yes, it's been passed down through generations. A cherished keepsake, really." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Indeed. Sometimes these symbols can reveal hidden affiliations or loyalties that may not be immediately apparent." With that, Miss Marple returned to the group, her mind now piecing together the significance of the brooch. The insignia was a critical clue, linking the wearer to a network that could potentially have motives rooted in deep-seated grudges and hidden agendas. As the train continued its journey, the tension in the lounge car remained palpable. Miss Marple's subtle probing had intensified the suspicions, yet the true culprits remained elusive. The unique brooch had provided a tantalizing hint, a piece of the puzzle that pointed toward a darker, more intricate motive. She knew that the next steps would require careful navigation, balancing her role as an observer with the need to uncover the truth. The arrival of the police at the next station would complicate matters, but Miss Marple was determined to ensure that all the pieces of the puzzle were in place before the final revelation. As midnight deepened, Miss Marple felt the threads of deceit and hidden motives intertwining, leading her ever closer to the heart of the mystery. The brooch, the strained relationships, and the orchestrated poisonings had woven a web that only her sharp mind could unravel. With each passing moment, she moved one step closer to unveiling the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of the Silver Line Express. Finally, as the train began to approach the next station, Miss Marple felt the time had come to lay bare the full extent of the conspiracy. She stood once more before the assembled passengers, her presence commanding the room's full attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm yet resolute, "the truth behind Mr. Pembroke's untimely demise is far more intricate than any one of us initially suspected. It was not the act of a single individual, but a coordinated effort involving several of us here today." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as Miss Marple continued. "Each of you held a grudge against Mr. Pembroke, whether through business dealings, personal vendettas, or indirect consequences of his ruthless actions. Together you devised a plan to ensure his permanent removal by poisoning his meals, using your collective access to manipulate the situation without immediate detection." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, her eyes meeting each passenger in turn. "Mrs. Agatha Green and Thomas Reed, your roles in the kitchen provided the perfect opportunity to administer the poison discreetly. Mr. Arthur Blake, your business disputes with Mr. Pembroke fueled the motivation behind this scheme. Samuel Turner, your meticulous nature and access to the dining car enabled you to orchestrate the plan seamlessly. And Mrs. Margaret Pembroke, your calm exterior concealed a deep-seated desire to protect your family from the fallout of your husband's ruthless actions." The room fell silent, the gravity of Miss Marple's revelation dawning on each passenger. The once serene compartment now hummed with the weight of collective guilt and unspoken truths. Miss Marple concluded, her voice gentle yet firm. "While justice will undoubtedly be pursued by the authorities, it is clear that this tragic event was the result of a united front against a man whose actions affected us all deeply. Sometimes the pursuit of retribution can lead to unintended consequences, harming not just the intended target, but also innocent bystanders. As the police officers moved to secure the area and begin their investigation, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of melancholy. The collaboration of so many individuals to carry out the poisonings was a stark reminder of the destructive power of collective vengeance. Yet in the midst of the chaos, Miss Marple made a silent decision. She chose not to reveal the identities of the conspirators to the police, recognizing that the passengers themselves were burdened with the weight of their collective actions. By withholding this information, she allowed them the space to confront their guilt privately, rather than facing immediate legal repercussions. As the train finally came to a halt, Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, her mind heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. The police would take custody of the involved parties, but the true essence of their collective guilt would linger, a silent testament to the lengths they had gone to seek retribution. Back in her beloved village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair with a cup of tea, reflecting on the recent events aboard the Silver Line Express. The complexity of human motives and the intertwined relationships had created a tragic tapestry of vengeance and unintended consequences. She mused over the delicate balance between justice and compassion, understanding that sometimes the truth needed to be handled with a gentle touch. Button curled up beside her, purring contentedly as Miss Marple mused over the case. "People often hide behind facades, Button," she mused aloud. "But with a bit of patience and attention, the truth always finds its way to the surface." As the evening sun set over the village, Miss Marple felt a sense of peace, knowing that her keen observations and understanding of human nature had once again brought clarity to a tangled mystery. The secrets aboard the Silver Line Express had been unveiled, and while justice was served, the emotional scars would remain, a poignant reminder of the consequences of collective vengeance. With a satisfied smile, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, ever ready for the next mystery that might come her way. The village of St. Mary Mead remained a haven of calm and order, a perfect backdrop for Miss Marple's unique gift of unraveling the most intricate of human intrigues. And as the night enveloped her cottage, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the quiet moments that allowed her to reflect, rejuvenate, and prepare for whatever mysteries the future might hold.